So joining us is Larry Kelley from the Delaware Aviation Museum Foundation, owner of Panchito, the B-25. And one of the things it has is the Living History Flight Experience waiver from the FAA. So Larry, tell us about that. Most people don't have any sense of what that is and what it takes to get one, and why would you want one?
Well, the FAA, there was a huge public demand for decades to be able to fly in, historically significant, especially World War II crew-served airplanes is where it all really started. And in the background in some of the FAA documents, and I'll actually read directly from it, says the FAA has historically found that the preservation of U.S. aviation history to be in the public interest, including preservation of certain former military aircraft transferred to private individuals or organizations for the purpose of restoring and operating these aircraft. And but most of these aircraft were not built to standard airworthiness certificate. They have either an experimental or a limited. So, for instance, most of the bombers are under limited category. Most Mustangs are under limited category. Mm-hmm. So, specifically with the FARs, there is a FAR 91.315 for limited categories. Civil aircraft operating limitation says no person may operate a limited category civil aircraft carrying passengers or property for compensation or hire. These are airplanes, that were declared surplus after World War II mostly, and used for research. But when they're not used in the military, you had to have some type of a certificate. So standard didn't apply. They weren't built to standard rules. So they were built by the military. So this limited category airworthiness certificate came out, and/or experimental for some other aircraft, but they were limited to no passengers, for hire. So they were used for research. They were used as fire bombers and these kind of things. But then it began to be restored back to the original configuration. And many people, like you and I, remember our parents who were in World War II. There was a huge demand for this experience to try to understand what they were. Uh-huh. And as they recognizes to be able to preserve U.S. aviation history, the people operating these needed to be able to receive compensation for these rides to be able to afford to keep them flying, to keep alive that history. But the FAA needed to form some type of a equivalency for safety and training to those operators that are operating aircraft for hire. For instance, like a Part 135 operator. So as an example, you and I could go out to the B-25 today. Let's set the LHFE aside. Let's say we're going to just go out and fly. You have a multi-engine rating. You have at least a private with a multi-engine rating, and you have a current medical. So, and I'm type rated in the airplane with a multi-engine rating, obviously. So you and I could go out and get in the airplane, and we could go flying. Perfectly legal. You could be in that second seat as the SIC. But does that really make good sense in a passenger carrying environment where you need an equivalent level of safety to what you would see, say, if you were going out and hiring a Part 135 to take you from point A to point B?
Right.
So the FAA came up with policies, procedures, and for a while had a moratorium on this while they rethought this, and they came back then with a modified LHFE program that adds a lot to what's called that equivalency for safety and training. And so, for instance, now, for me to be able to fly with passengers, I would need to have at least a commercial multi-engine rating and instrument rating. Even though the LHFEs are all conducted under day VFR, we have to have a multi-engine rating and at least an instrument rating. Within the previous 12 calendar months, I have to comply with a ground training program, flight training program, and the 6158 check, with the FAA designated airman. Have to have a minimum, just a minute, let me refer back to that page, 2,500 total time, 1,000 hours multi-engine time, 25 hours in the B-25, or 1,000 hours total, 200 multi-engine, and 100 hours in B-25 with 50 takeoff and landings to be pilot command. You as second command to be on board to be able to take passengers would have to have at least 1,500 total time, 250 multi-engine, or 500 total time, 100 multi-engine, and 25 hours in B-25s with 10 takeoff and landings. a dramatically different amount of experience to be required to be able to take passengers. Plus, you then, instead of just climbing in and me showing you where the throttles are and, kick the tires and light the fires, as they say, you would have to attend our ground school, which you have. You'd have to attend our ground school. You would have to go through an SIC training program. This is annually, every 12 months.
Right.
Training program and a flight check, all to be able to do this, plus your 3 takeoff and landings every, minimum within 90 days,
Right,
to be able to qualify for that SIC rating. Along with that, in the previous example where we're just going to go flying, we don't have to have a system of manuals, whatever. I just have to maintain the airplane within the limitations of my maintenance program that is an approved maintenance program for that specific airplane. But under this program, we have to maintain it not only that, but we have to have a whole system of manuals, operating manuals, safety manuals, very, very close to a Part 135 operation. That is what came out of the moratorium, was that these aircraft, if we're going to be taking a limited category airplane or an experimental category airplane, we want to make sure that they are operated, maintained within the similar parameters for equivalency in safety.
right,
And also that the pilot training is an equivalent level of safety as far as recurrency training, far and above what it would take to just be able to go out and fly the airplane. So the FAA has done an outstanding job in rewriting the whole LHFE program and making it as they use an equivalent level of safety. Now, one question I think you asked is, what does it take to even get an LHFE? Well, first of all, the FAA went out and they decided we've got to define what kind of aircraft are even eligible for this. Because originally it was the crew-served multi-engine aircraft of World War II was pretty much all that was in it. It was, started with EAA with their B-17 aluminum overcast. And, there was a huge public demand for people who wanted to be able to experience what it was like for their parents, their grandparents, their aunts, their uncles, their brothers, et cetera, to fly these aircraft, many of which lost their lives, these airplanes. And we have to keep these airplanes flying. These are our icons of our military history. And those of us that own these airplanes are the ones that need to keep them flying. To remember, the huge sacrifices of tens of thousands of American airmen. So the FAA decided we need to look at and define what aircraft are even eligible for this. First of all, they have to be historically significant. That's the term used within the guidance. And they have to meet the following criteria. Has to become an aircraft that was a U.S. operated aircraft. For instance, if let's say we had a Heinkel bomber, that is not a U.S. airplane. It would not be eligible under the LHFE program. It was not a U.S. operated airplane. This is to preserve the history of American aviation, U.S. aviation, U.S. military aviation. So it had to be U.S. operated. It has to be an aircraft that's not in service anymore. And it has to be fragile. Now, fragile not meaning like an eggshell. Fragile means that there is not a lot of examples left, and that without keeping these things flying, they may become, let me just read you what they say. The aircraft must be fragile, meaning a factor that necessitates preservation. If there are hundreds of models of particular aircraft still flying, that aircraft's existence would not be considered fragile. If, on the other hand, there are few remaining aircraft and the model could become extinct without preservation efforts, that aircraft will be considered fragile. So that's what the term fragile means, is without keeping it flying, it could become extinct or no longer even exist.
Right.
Age. The original type design must be at least 50 years old. Okay, that's significant. So we're not going to be going out there and getting in like a T6A Texan, the new T6 Texan, and putting that in the LHFE program. So at least 50 years old. And no available standard category airplane. I didn't know a lot about this when I first applied for my exemption 15 years ago. So when I first did my petition to be exempted from 91315, 119.5, 119.21, for instance, the different FARs that would prohibit me from carrying passengers on a limited category airplane, I also included my UC-78 in that, the old bamboo bomber, used as a multi-engine trainer in World War II. And flown by Sky King, and what we all remember from our youth, the Sky King program. So they came back, and we also included a Yak-9 in that, a two-seater Yak-9. Well, they came back and said the Yak-9 is not eligible because it was not U.S. made. The UC-78 is not eligible because there is a standard category airworthiness certificate for that. So you can do rides in that under Part 91, just what's called sightseeing tours.
Right.
So the UC-78, all I had to do was very simple, just get a letter of authorization to do sightseeing tours, because like a PT-17, Stearman, they may have been used by the military, but it's a standard airworthiness certificate.
Right.
So it would not be eligible under this. You take a Stearman in and do under just sightseeing tours. But
so, so let me ask you another question, Larry. What are you concerned about what may happen with this exemption? You've described it's a very sophisticated document that really puts a lot of controls in place. But given the context of the B-17 accident a couple of weeks ago, are you concerned about what may happen with the folks who hold these exemptions like you do?
I'm always concerned when people who don't know what they're talking about, like a particular senator that went on the air right after the accident and started talking about, we ought to ground these airplanes and et cetera. You really don't know what he's talking about. These airplanes are maintained to an equivalent level of safety. The pilots are all trained to an equivalent level of safety to a Part 135 operation. And they say, well, these are old airplanes. Well, yeah, they are, but that doesn't mean they're not, any longer airworthy. They are certainly plenty airworthy. And accidents happen. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I said I was far more worried about driving around the Washington Beltway trying to get home, because my life was a whole lot more at risk on the Washington Beltway than it was getting in my B-25 and going flying. When you talk about per passenger mile, flying in these B-17s and the B-24s and the B-25s and et cetera, look how many flight operations there have been in the last, let's say, 10 years with all of these airplanes operating under the living history flight exemption. We've got a pretty good safety record all total.
Right.
Yeah, there was a bad accident with a B-17, really, really bad accident. Apparently they may have lost two engines on the right side. That's something like that happened is so extremely rare. But as I recall, I think we lost two space shuttles, didn't we? Weren't they pretty well maintained?
Yeah.
Last weekend I was at Atlanta Air Show. One of the snowbirds went in, engine failure, went in. The guy was brilliant. He guided the airplane down to an open field, punched out just at treetop level. He came down 100 yards from his airplane, so he didn't get out of it until right at the last minute. You think the snowbirds are maintaining their airplanes well? Do you think they're training their pilots well? Do you think they have a pretty good safety record? Yeah, they do. The Blue Angels have had airplanes they've lost. The Thunderbirds have lost airplanes. You just read something about the military losing an airplane here all too frequently. 737 MAX, we just lost two of them. How many people? So we look around aviation. Is this really that much different, or is it just someone's knee-jerk action?
Right.
If someone goes out and wrecks a Model T, should we suddenly take all the Model Ts off the road and not allow Model T to drive on a highway anymore?
Right.
We need to look at all of this in the entire context of the tens of thousands of veterans that took these airplanes in the air, and there's still tremendous demand there is from the American public to keep these airplanes flying and to preserve this history as long as it's done safely. And those of us within the LHFE program, we're a very tight-knit community. We're not a bunch of wahoos running around out there. We all know each other. We have regular meetings,
right.
And those meetings are surrounding safety of operation. How can we operate these airplanes safely? How can we support each other in operating of these airplanes? We offer suggestions to each other on training. Our flight training program, that we put together was to help train P-25 pilots to an equivalent level of safety to if you're flying the airlines or if you're flying Part 135. Our program is ran by two airline training pilots, so we're all out there trying to maintain this. Could there be some problems? I think some of the knee-jerk responses, hopefully, are seen as exactly that, and the level heads, will prevail. There's been a tremendous amount of support of the Collins Foundation. I know those people. They run a good, tight organization. They are very conscientious. What happened at the airplane is that 1 in a million situations. To lose two engines on a 4-engine airplane, within that short a period of time, it's just almost unheard of.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah, I am concerned. We all are.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Larry, for what you do to keep living history alive with Panchito and for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks, Tom.